So when you're giving feedback, it's really important that it sticks. In this video, I was doing a Google search and I came up with one of those suggested terms that I found super interesting. And that term was giving feedback to teachers after observation. It was interesting to me that this was sort of common enough to be suggested to me, that obviously teachers all around the world are looking up how do we give feedback to teachers after they have been observed. I found a really interesting article from that search term that I wanted to share with you. It's from the National Association of Elementary School Principals, and the article is titled Teacher Observation Feedback That Sticks. And that sticks part, that each letter stands for something. And it's a kind of framework or process for running teacher observations. And I think it's really important to have a structure, a framework, a process, a template, something to do these feedback sessions in quite a structured way. And the reason is that it's kind of tempting to do a lesson and the teacher goes, I thought that went well, or that wasn't amazing. And that's kind of the starting point for the discussion. I think if you're going to have kind of rich, reflective discussions, that the starting point needs to be something a bit more detailed. That you can start by saying to the teacher that you've observed, how did you think that went? But I think there needs to be something more structured in terms of process to get really good outcomes in teachers reflecting back on their practice and where they can potentially improve. So if I think about this S.T.I.C.K.S methodology, is that it's all about providing high quality observation after you have seen a teacher and a demonstration lesson or an observation lesson. So the first S stands for specific. What this article talks about is not giving a long list, a laundry list of the good and bad things that the teacher did during a particular lesson. Instead, do you want to focus on one or two specific points of emphasis during the lesson? And that's interesting to think about, because if you've made the time and changed your schedule to observe another teacher, why would you only provide one or two bits of feedback? And the thing is that the more feedback you give someone, the kind of more overwhelmed they can feel. I find this with students a lot. I try and keep it very targeted and limited in terms of the number of bits of feedback I provide. So that the article is talking about provide one or two specific bits of feedback and have that supported by evidence that you have witnessed during the demonstration or observation lesson. And this leads into the T part of the S.T.I.C.K.S, which is tied to evidence. Every observation or comment or bit of feedback that is given to a teacher that has been observed needs to be tied back to something that is specific and observable. For example, this article talks about if a teacher gives feedback to another teacher of saying, your classroom was very noisy during this observation lesson. What would be different might be having a teacher say, I noticed students at the back table were not able to hear your instructions due to the talking on one side, and they lost time during the activity waiting for you to come over to re-explain it. So that rather than saying, oh, your classroom's noisy, you got to control your kids, instead you're saying, you know what, up the back, it was too loud for them, they couldn't hear the instructions, and then you had to repeat it, which then lost time during the lesson. So the I part in S.T.I.C.K.S stands for includes identified action steps. So the thing is that when you have observed something and discussed it with the teacher, is then to talk about what are you going to do about this next time. And this is a really key part, I think, with the noisy classroom example before, that maybe the observing teacher would say, next time, when you're giving instructions, make sure you pause, wait for quiet, remind students to be quiet, and then, and only then, give the instructions. And you might even say, lower your voice, make them lean in and hear you, and then ask students to repeat the instructions, what has been asked of them in terms of what they need to do. So that you are tying this all together in terms of, here's something specific I observed. here is the evidence of what I saw, and then here is an identified action step, the I in the S.T.I.C.K.S. The next thing is that there is a process for checking for follow-up, so that after the observation that things have been discussed and maybe some commitments have been made to at least try some different things, but there needs to be another step to check in with the teacher and say, how are you going with these things? What have you tried? What has your experience been? Do you need some additional assistance or suggestions, or maybe a follow-up observation of a much shorter time frame to check in on some of the things that have been discussed? So part of it as well is setting the expectation that once an observation is done, that's not the end of the story, that there will be follow-ups, there will be ongoing discussions, that the process will continue, so that the teachers know that their practice continually needs to be improved and modified and acted on as part of the school culture. I think K is a very important part of this process as well, and that is for the feedback to be kindly delivered. Now, I think that this is very evident with students, is that when we are delivering feedback in a sort of kind and supportive manner, that can often glean better results than to present it more matter-of-factly or with a greater emphasis on the negative. So here it's talking about providing that feedback that encourages high standards and improvement when teachers are more receptive, and to encourage that to be positive in terms of the suggestions. We're not questioning teachers' ability overall. We're not calling into practice their entire practice. Rather, we are talking about very specific, identifiable elements that we would like to help them improve. The final S is student-centered. So in terms of all the things that have been done up to this point, there needs to be a focus on how will this improve student outcomes? How will this improve student learning, engagement, and results? That the student needs to be at the center of all of this process. That if you go back to that noisy classroom, that you can think about, well, we're not criticizing you for the noisy classroom. We're bringing it back to the students, that this idea, if they can't hear or they are distracted, then they can't learn to the best of their ability, that they might fall behind, that this might be multiplied over the course of many classes. It's a real strength of this framework that students have such an important role, and that the observations do come back to what could the positive implications be here of changing our practice in terms of student outcomes across a range of factors. So I find this S.T.I.C.K.S framework really useful, quite simple, I think relatively easy to implement in the context of the observations that take place in schools. If you've got any questions about giving teacher feedback or some ideas on how you do it at your school, please put that in the comments. In terms of the next video to watch, can I suggest this one? I think this will be pretty interesting, and I'll see you in the next one.